Well, hello, good evening, and welcome to episode 115 of Fracking Nightmare. Now, it does seem a long time since I was last in the studio for an episode of Fracking Nightmare, and it is indeed. It's actually a little over 5 months, would you believe? And back then, we were on the cusp of the first frack being conducted in the UK at Kirkby Misperton. And, well, more of that a little later. But one of the reasons that I haven't been quite so diligent in producing episodes of Fracking Nightmare is because I have continued the daily live stream updates at 8:30 each weekday morning. And apparently somebody who has a lot of time on their hands sent me an email saying that I've actually done 134 live stream updates at 8:30 each morning since I started them in September of last year. So I guess tomorrow morning will be number 135. So please do join me on my YouTube channel, and where it goes out live, and also on the Ian Rowland Crane Facebook page. That's Facebook permitting and assuming that I'm not in Facebook jail, which seems to be happening with increasing regularity. Now, before I get into tonight's program, I've received a request from the Missing Springs Protection Camp. Now, I do spend as much time as I can on the camp, but I also have other commitments, so I'm probably only there for about a third of the time. Now, Missing Springs is in North Nottinghamshire. Now, it's in a very, very unique location, and as I have observed on numerous occasions during my live stream broadcasts, iGas chose this location very, very well, because here's Nottingham, right down in the southwest of the county, and here's where Missing Springs Protection Camp is located, just a short distance from the well site. So here's the well site at Missing Springs, and here's the Missing Springs Protection Camp. That's about half a mile or so. And the Missing Springs Protection Camp also supports the Tinker Lane community, which is just about 5 miles to the south, located between Blythe and Barnby Moor. So this is the location of the Missing Springs Protection Camp. It's a beautiful location, beautiful rural location, very weak phone signal, and it's only sporadic in spots around the field there. But the remoteness of this camp means that it's very difficult for the local community to support the camp. And the camp is actually struggling to even maintain reasonable food supplies for the 15 or so people that are currently on the camp supporting the community at both Missing and in Tinker Lane. So I had a call from the camp earlier today saying, please, could I put out a call for donations? So if you're in the north of Nottinghamshire and you fancy taking a trip to the Missing Springs Protection Camp, then simply punch in Missing Springs into your sat-nav, and that will actually take you directly to the camp. The postcode for the camp is DN10 6ES. And if you're able to make a PayPal donation, then the camp PayPal account is MSPC, that's Missing Springs Protection Camp, but it's just the abbreviation, MSPC 2018 at hotmail.com. And if you would like to actually make a donation via a direct bank transfer, then please message me or text me, and I will provide you with the bank account details. But at the moment, the camp has only had nominal financial support from the local community, and it has actually had to be self-funding, and whilst it's waiting on donations coming in from elsewhere. So if you are able to help out either with physical food donations or to make a financial donation, let me put that back on screen again. The PayPal account is mspc2018 at hotmail.com. And this is what the well site at Tinker Lane looks like. Right now, there's no activity at the Misson Springs well site, seeing as Nottinghamshire County Council have yet to make a decision following iGas's request to lift Clause 21, which prevents them from working during the bird breeding season or the owl breeding season. And so if Nottinghamshire County Council don't make a decision, then there won't be any work there until September. But meanwhile, work is going ahead at Tinker Lane. And what we see here is the spudding rig. So this is the rig that will drill the initial hole, insert the conductor casing, and then the main rig will come on site probably in the next 7 to 10 days, give or take. And the main rig will be 100 feet tall, and the well site will be lit 24/7. And perhaps at that point, the residents of Blythe and Barnby and those people who use the 634 there as a rat run from the A1 will start to perhaps consider the implications that this rig will have and the potential frack will have on their communities. Now, let me just go back to this location here, because right up here in North Nottinghamshire, this is a peninsula. It's a very rural peninsula of North Nottinghamshire. And just across here, you can see we have the Doncaster Sheffield Airport. So this is South Yorkshire, and this over here is Lincolnshire. And I received an email, and in fact, somebody posted a similar message on my YouTube video, I think either today or yesterday, stating that there's no way that the people of South Yorkshire will ever cross the border to help those in Nottinghamshire. We have long memories, and 1984 is not forgotten. And of course, this is a reference to the miners' strike, where the Nottinghamshire miners continued working whilst the miners elsewhere went on strike to try to save their jobs and the mines. So here we are, 34 years on, and this is a generational thing. But I do have this to say. The contamination and the seismic events, more of which later, which will occur as a result of this industry, does not respect county borders. So, in fact, the people in this area here of South Yorkshire and the people here in Lincolnshire are at far greater risk than the people in the Nottinghamshire communities a few miles to the south. So, you know, whilst I appreciate the sentiment of 1984 and the hangover and the legacy of the bitterness that occurred between the communities during the miners' strike, now is the time to put that to rest. Because what's occurring here, just in this peninsula of Nottinghamshire, could, and I would suggest will, have significant negative impact on the people in this area here. Okay, so what else has been going on? Well, not yesterday, I've lost track of days. On Tuesday, I was at the House of Lords to give my support to this gentleman, Professor Emeritus Peter Stiles, who is formerly of Keele University. Now, this was an interesting event because Peter Stiles has really always been pro-fracking. But to be fair, pro-regulated fracking. Now, pro-regulated fracking isn't on my agenda. It's not in my vocabulary because I know fine well that this is an industry that cannot be regulated. All of the blag we hear about gold standard regulation, every community in in Australia, in the US, in Canada, they've heard the same BS time and time again, only for problems to arise once the fracking activity commences. Well, Peter Stiles was at the House of Lords to present this paper, and it's titled Fracking and Historic Coal Mining, Their Relationship and Should They Coincide? Now, he makes some very, very interesting observations, and I'm going to share some of them with you in a second. But this is one of his slides that really caught my eye. And this is included in the report, which you can download from the Talk Fracking website. And in fact, I will put a link beneath this video so that you can go straight to it. But what you see on the screen here is the log of Quadrilla's activity at Priest Hall back in 2011 when they triggered the seismic events there, which ultimately led to the moratorium being put on the unconventional gas industry in the UK from August of that year. But look at this. Here is the log of activities. Now the DFIT, that's the diagnostic fracture injection test. So that's like the mini frac to just test the integrity of the well and make sure that they can pressurize the well, and they will take the pressure up to the point at which the geology starts to fracture. And then they ease back, and then a little while later they'll do the main job. So what we see on the screen here is the first stage, which was conducted or the DFIT test on the 26th of March, and then the actual frac job 2 days later on the 28th of March. And then the second stage, the DFIT test, was done on the 30th of March, with the frac job being run on the 31st of March. Now on the 1st of April, the following day, that was when the 2.3 seismic event was triggered. Now here's the kicker. On the 4th of April, so 4 days later, it was actually established by Quadrilla that they had deformed the casing, and this was confirmed with the caliper test, and that it was deformed between 8,480 feet and 8,640 feet. Literally just below the next zone that was being targeted for the frac job. So even though they knew that they had deformed the casing, they still went ahead with the test on the 8th of April and then ran the frac job between 8,420 feet and 8,489 feet. In other words, they actually ran the frac job 9 feet into the zone with deformed casing, knowingly. And such was their incompetence that there was no way that they were going to pull the plug, and they wanted to keep with their schedule. So they waited nearly 6 weeks to run the next stage, because obviously knowing that they had already triggered a seismic event, knowing that they had deformed the casing, I guess that they wanted to see whether there was any further seismic activity. So they ran the next test on the 25th of May and ran the full job on the 26th of May. And that was between 8,020 feet and 8,259 feet. And then on the following day, another seismic event was triggered at 1.5. But yet they still went ahead that same day with another DFIT test and ran the frac job. And something made them stop on the 31st, because they only ran the initial mini frac before deciding to pull the plug on the 6th stage. So here is prima facie evidence that Quadrilla lack the competence. And of course, this was challenged by Ed Davey. He wrote directly to Lord Brown, who was chairman of Quadrilla at that time. And he literally berated Lord Brown for the incompetence of Quadrilla. And then coincidentally, a few weeks later, was removed from his job as Energy Secretary. So here's what Professor Peter Stiles has to say about that. He says, although the first frac stage was completed without incident, after the second frac stage, a sequence of 52 seismic events occurred, and the first to be noticed was a 2.3 event on the 1st of April 2011. There were precursory events which might have been detected and used as precautionary warning, but as there was no local seismic monitoring, despite my advice that this would be prudent, these were not detected until subsequent analysis of regional seismic records took place. Well, I guess that, Peter Stiles should have been listened to. But hey, he's an academic. And, these arrogant Texan oilfield guys, well, actually Mark Miller's not Texan, I don't believe, because it was Mark Miller who headed up the organization at that time. And the sheer arrogance of Mark Miller said, no, we'll just run it anyway. Well, Professor Stiles now has another concern, and that is that the Boland Shale primarily sits above the old coal measures that were mined extensively, in some cases for over 2 centuries. And if we put this graphic on screen here, what you're looking at there, on the left-hand side, these are all the fissures, all the faults within the Yorkshire coalfield. And what you see on the right-hand side there is all of the coal mines. Now, these are the surface entrances to the coal mines in Cheshire or Staffordshire, Cheshire, and coming up into Lancashire, and then coming across the Pennines into Yorkshire and down into Nottinghamshire. And coincidentally, that's exactly where the primary target for fracking of the Boland Shale sits beneath. And what you see on this graphic is literally all of the fault lines, the known fault lines, and it is acknowledged that there may be others that are unknown. And Professor Stiles makes the observation that the seismic testing that is conducted by these companies is actually inadequate. The equipment is not sensitive enough to pick up some of the faults that lie at the deeper depths. And what you see, going back to this graphic, what we see here is all of the known fault lines around the areas which are being targeted by INEOS. These are the locations. We got Hart Hill and Woodsets. So these are the locations, Woodsets and Marsh Lane here. So these are the 3 locations that INEOS wants to target. And right on top of these fault lines. So they want to drill down through the coal measures and frack beneath these heavily faulted coal seams. What could possibly go wrong? Especially when you take account that each of these white dots actually represents the epicenters of previous recorded seismic activity. So Professor Stiles, in his report on page 38, says it is evident that this information already exists for the United Kingdom, albeit buried in the archives of the UK Coal Authority at present, and should be considered to be an integral part of the geological database, which is considered as part of the planning process for shale gas, or indeed any deep underground activities in areas where coal mines have been worked in the UK. Now, at the moment, there isn't a requirement, despite the gold standard, there isn't a requirement in the planning process for these companies to share their research into the fault lines as per the data held by the UK Coal Authority. So this is somewhat remiss, Peter Stiles would argue, but of course the industry would argue, well, we'd rather not see it, because if we do see it, it might actually prevent us from doing what we want to do. And Professor Stiles has put forward the proposition that there should be an exclusion zone of at least 850 meters between any well and a known fault line. Well, Professor Stiles has been supported very much by Joe Corry, and after the presentation in the House of Lords, I went across to St Stephen's Green and did a short interview there with Joe Corry. And Professor Stiles had gone off to give interviews to Russia Today and the BBC. So Joe Corry joined me on the green to share his thoughts on Professor Stiles' presentation. So this report runs to just 43 pages. It is written very much in terms that the layman can understand. And I would literally encourage everyone who lives in North Staffordshire, Cheshire, Lancashire, Yorkshire, Nottinghamshire, to download a copy of this report, read through it, and understand exactly what Professor Stiles' concerns are. And when the companies like INEOS and iGas and Quadrilla dismiss it, then you will know firsthand that basically they lack the professionalism, they lack the competence to be tasked with attempting to run a frack in these areas. So fortunately, the mainstream media did pick it up. And like I said, Professor Stiles did some interviews with the BBC, although I think it was BBC Look East or Look Northeast. And The Independent ran this article. Fracking could cause earthquakes across huge swathes of UK, warns former Downing Street advisor and seismologist. Because Peter Stiles confirms that he advised David Cameron and George Osborne some 4 years ago that to push ahead with the fracking agenda in the north of England was literally a disaster waiting to happen. Now, like I said, Professor Stiles is actually pro-regulated fracking. And his motivation here is that he doesn't want this industry to literally be shut down from day one because of its incompetence in analysing the data that is available. They just have to look a little bit harder, i.e. contact the UK Coal Authority, because the information is there and it can help them avoid creating the disaster. I mean, from my perspective, hey, don't look at it, guys, just go ahead. Because if you do frack in these areas, then the prognosis, according to Professor Stiles, is pretty clear. Well, this was picked up literally a few hours ago by Engineering and Technology, and this is the headline on their website: serious earthquake risk with fracking near coalfields. The government is warned. And this is an extract. Stiles has called for more rigorous checks for any operations occurring near old mines as the government discusses legislation that could make it easier to explore shale gas deposits and carry out fracking. He said there was a serious earthquake risk from fracking in former coalfield areas because induced seismicity is dramatically enhanced in a significant portion of land designated for fracking operations. Former coalfields already have a risk of earthquakes, and fracking exacerbates the potential for seismic activity in those areas. And of course, Ollerton in Nottinghamshire is the earthquake capital of the UK. Stiles has recommended that all future fracking operations maintain at least a 500-metre buffer zone between former mine workings and current and future energy extraction technologies. He also said an 850-metre buffer zone should be created between fracking and any significant natural fractures or faults. He continues, fracking and historic coal mining, the relationship, and should they coincide, highlights a potentially dangerous fault line within 10 metres of the proposed fracking borehole at Hart Hill, just south of Sheffield, which plastics manufacturer INEOS wants to drill. Labour MP for Rother Valley, Sir Kevin Barron, said, Professor Stiles' report makes for worrying reading, and I hope the government takes action to implement his recommendations immediately. I believe fracking in coal mining areas is a disaster waiting to happen. They should be listening to Professor Stiles and not trying to relax the planning rules as they did last week, more of which later. The Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy spokesman said, the UK has over 50 years of experience in regulating the onshore oil and gas industry, meaning the sector is governed by one of the safest, most environmentally sound and well-regulated systems in the world. These strong control and laws will ensure shale gas can be explored safely and sustainably. Excuse me while I gag. That is classic PR speak put out by a marketing graduate with zero experience of working the coal seams or the unconventional gas industry. And in fact, Professor Stiles makes the observations that now that effectively the coal industry has been defunct for 30 odd years, then the knowledge and expertise associated with coal mining activities is fast evaporating. So, Who ultimately is going to carry the can when this all goes pear-shaped? Well, let's take a look at Greg Clark. And of course, Greg Clark was very much the focus of my early morning broadcasts between September right through to early February, because Greg Clark had been asked to sign off on Third Energy's application to frack at Kirby Misperton. More of which in a second. But he has now announced, in conjunction with his new cohort in crime, James Brockenshire, that they're looking to accelerate and fast-track fracking applications. As the communities and their local councils across the UK have said no in every way they can, but the government have turned a deaf ear to everyone who doesn't own a fossil fuel company. So, the lobby group of Jim Ratcliffe and Tom Pickering, Francis Egan, Stephen Ebola, Stephen Sanderson, and the likes, apparently they are a very, very powerful lobby. Well, I guess they're taking the right people out to lunch or flying them off for, weekends golfing. New plans to accelerate fracking development have been released by the government amid accusation that the move will harm the environment and local communities. Proposed changes to the planning process could put an area nearly the size of Wales at immediate risk of drilling. That's the same area that Professor Stiles has urged caution over. The measures are intended to speed up planning applications and make decisions faster and fairer for all those involved. Greg Clark, the Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy Secretary, and James Brockenshire, the new Housing and Community Secretary, issued a joint statement in which they reiterated the government's position on the importance of safe, sustainable exploration and the development of our onshore shale gas. Well, I have actually put forward an alternative hypothesis here, because Greg Clark is reportedly a very ambitious politician. He's 50 years of age. Coincidentally, James Brockenshire is also 50 years of age. Maybe not quite as ambitious as Greg Clark. So has Greg Clark pulled Brockenshire into the equation to take off a little bit of the heat? Or are these two relatively young politicians actually trying to find a way to kick this industry into touch by creating such a situation that communities metaphorically rise up to resist this industry in ways that we haven't seen yet? Well, they're also looking to combine the Oil and Gas Authority, the Environment Agency and the Health and Safety Executive. And of course, the Oil and Gas Authority is effectively the cheerleader for the unconventional gas industry. It is a private limited company where the only shareholder is the Secretary of State for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, which is, Greg Clark. So when Greg Clark says, but it's not me making the decision, it will be the Oil and Gas Authority, he omits to mention that he is the sole shareholder of this private limited company. So sorry, Greg, can't get away with that one. But then we have the Environment Agency and the Health and Safety Executive, of course, who all point fingers at each other. So when things go wrong, they say, well, it wasn't us, it was them. So now they're looking to combine these agencies and create a new super regulatory agency combining the key elements of these three groups. Now, I looked at the potential acronyms for this new group, and basically all I could come up with is HOGSHAG. And of course, this would be quite an appropriate acronym, because of course it does actually make reference indirectly to the two individuals who actually got the current Tory administration into this mess in the first place. And that, of course, is none other than David Cameron and his old mucker, George Osborne. And, of course, they succumbed to the overtures of Lord John Brown, who was appointed as David Cameron's special advisor on energy just a week after he was elected back in May of 2010. And Lord John Brown, of course, was also chairman of Quadrilla, so no vested interest there, eh? Well, Lord John Brown has subsequently ridden off into the sunset, I think realising that the likelihood of this industry actually getting off the ground and has even less likelihood of actually succeeding. So he's gone on to pursue other interests. And of course, Hogshag is also a reference to the initiation ceremony reportedly undertaken by members of the Bullingdon Club. And of course, David Cameron and George Osborne were indeed both members of that club. Now, to the best of my knowledge, Greg Clark and James Brockenshire certainly weren't. So, does anyone have any hold over these guys other than threatening them with limited career progression unless they carry out the will of the unconventional gas industry? Well, I think the onus now is very much on communities, particularly targeted communities in the sacrifice zone, to really start to participate in the process. Just as occurred in North Yorkshire. And, 5 months ago, I was actually pointing out on a very regular basis that Kirby Misperton was very much in the hands of Greg Clark, and making the observation that it would be impossible for Greg Clark to sign off on Third Energy's application to frack when they hadn't published their accounts, which were due to be published on the 30th of September of last year. They submitted their application to frack in early November, but they didn't actually publish their accounts until end of January. So 4 months late. So that's what Kirby Misperton looked like back in November of 2017. So this was another disaster waiting to happen. As you can see here on the frack pad, this is quite possibly the most congested frack pad I have ever seen. This was, without any shadow of doubt, an unsafe working environment, and it was very clear that Third Energy had not worked with the local emergency services to establish any kind of emergency plan, which is somewhat remiss considering that this well site was within half a mile of the village of Kirby Misperton. So Third Energy, under the leadership of John Dewar, certainly until the end of November last year, was trying to get the permission to frack so that they could then go to their creditors and actually borrow more money. Well, that didn't happen, because when the accounts were published, it eventually became very clear that this was a dog, a total dog. Well, I'm pleased to say that Greg Clark did the right thing, and that's pretty much what the well site at Kirby Misperton looks like now. The well has not been fracked, and actually the likelihood of that well being fracked anytime soon, I would suggest, is slim to none. So over the months of February and March, Third Energy were exiting the well site with their frack pumps firmly tucked between their legs. So, well done to the community in North Yorkshire for the sustained campaign against Third Energy, against Barclays Bank, the owners of Third Energy, and very much flagging up to Greg Clark that it was his political career very much on the line if he made the wrong decision. So once again, let's gloat. That is the well site at Kirby Misperton, and hopefully that's the way it will stay now for the foreseeable future. Well, let's just have a look at the mess that Third Energy were in, and this is what subsequently led Greg Clark to state that in future all companies making application to frack in the UK would be subject to financial resilience tests. i.e. their finances would be put under scrutiny and would be examined by the Treasury. Although it seems that Greg Clark is somewhat reluctant to divulge precisely the detail of the financial resilience test. So still a little bit of obfuscation there. You know, so much for open government. It's only open when they feel like it being open. But let's take a look at these figures again, because these are very, very significant. So the total loss for the year up to, well, it's the year really ending 2016, but the accounts were due to be published on the end of September, and Third Energy had made a £3.4 million loss on revenue of just £750,000. So, you know, this is a company that is not viable. It's not solvent. It's hemorrhaging money. You know, basically we've got a situation here where the loss is 4 times greater than the revenue. So who on earth could ever believe that this is a sustainable entity? But of course, they were banking on the fact that once they fracked, that would all change. But, you know, only in their dreams. But let's take a look down here, because their liabilities, and this is truly staggering. The net liabilities of the company were £54.6 million. £54.6 million. So that is some nearly 70 times annual revenue. So even if every single pound of revenue was paid off or used to pay off the debt, it will take 70 years to repay. You know, now Barclays Bank have stated that they want to get shot of it. Well, they better, because the reality is that, you know, Barclays will once again come under scrutiny unless they live up to their commitment, which they've now made for the 2nd year running, to divest themselves of this dog company. But the reality is no one's going to touch it, with the possible exception of INEOS, because, you know, for Jim Ratcliffe, this is chump change. But at the Barclays AGM, John McFarlane, the chairman of Barclays, told investors, we want to get rid of this and to divest this asset. So that's pretty clear language there. It's got to go. Well, it's got to go because you know damn well that if it doesn't, then obviously awareness will continue to be raised, and Barclays customers will be encouraged to reflect upon whether or not they want to continue to do business with a bank that is supporting the unconventional gas industry. So, Greg Clark did the right thing. Now, he's got James Brockenshire in on the equation, and he's creating a new agency, a super agency, to help him make the right decision. Meanwhile, literally on the back of the media announcing Professor Stiles's concerns, the Environment Agency announces that there's risk of water shortages for England. England is facing water shortages by 2050 unless rapid action is taken to curb water use and wastage. The Environment Agency's new report says enough water to meet the needs of 20 million people is lost through leakage every day. Population growth and the impact of climate change are expected to add to supply pressures. The agency wants people to have a personal water target and has urged them to use water more wisely at home. The study, the first major report on water resources in England, says that population and climate change are the biggest pressures on a system that is already struggling. Well, let's make it very clear that when the water is lost to the water companies, it's not actually lost to the system, because whilst it leaks out of pipes, it is simply leaching back into the soil, and eventually it will migrate its way back into the aquifers. So it's not lost to the system. According to the Environment Agency, extraction of groundwater, the water beneath the Earth's surface, is not at a sustainable level. for 28% of groundwater bodies and up to 18% of surface waters. A year earlier, in 2016, unsustainable extraction meant that at least 6% and possibly up to 15% of river water bodies did not achieve a good ecological status or potential. The majority of chalk streams also failed to meet that standard, with over-extraction of water being responsible in a quarter of the streams that were tested. We need to change our attitudes to water use, said Emma Howard-Boyd, the Environment Agency chairwoman. Now, in Australia, the unconventional gas industry is abstracting water from the Great Artesian Basin, which literally is under 22% of the Australian continent. And abstracting water at a rate 6% greater than it can naturally replenish is a potential disaster. Already, farmers are struggling to extract water from their boreholes. They're having to drill deeper. They're having to put higher powered pumps to get water to the surface. And in some cases, the opposite occurs, and the aquifer becomes pressurized because the gas, the coal seam gas, is leaching from the geology into the aquifer, pressurizing the aquifer, and effectively causing blowouts, water blowouts. This is not sustainable in Australia. But at least Australia has the Great Artesian Basin. In the UK, we don't have a Great Artesian Basin. We don't have great lakes. We have small lakes, particularly in the Lake District. And we don't have a great river system. But we have some rivers because in London, for example, much of London's water comes from the Thames and the Lee Valley. But this is just enough to be able to sustain the population and existing industry and agriculture. And in fact, the Environment Agency report is now putting pressure on the agricultural industry to account for its usage. And yet, absurdly, the British government, despite the Environment Agency announcement and despite Professor Stiles' concerns, the British government wants to push ahead with an industry that will not only abstract phenomenal amounts of water, average 4 to 8 million gallons of water per well, but the water, once it is mixed with the chemicals for fracking, it is lost to the system. And not only is it lost to the system, but of course it will also potentially contaminate the groundwater supply, as it has done in many other locations around the world. So, there's an absurdity here. What is going on? Unless Greg Clark and James Brockenshire are trying to get the British public to help them by participating, by understanding that unless they participate, then unfortunately the likelihood is that the north of England is not only going to be fracked, there's going to be massive seismic activities, but there's also going to be massive water shortages and contamination of the water supply. Now, people say, well, isn't the government there to help us? Isn't the government there to make the right decisions? Obviously, you're not paying attention if you still believe that. The government is there to carry out the desires of the corporatocracy and to create this charade of regulatory control. And the industry will be putting all the resources it possibly can to bring the pressure to bear on James Brockenshire and Greg Clark just to crack on, cut all the red tape, just give us permission to go ahead. Well, these guys know that if they do that, their careers are basically over. And this is the area, of course, that is under threat. And guess what? It pretty much lies directly over all the old coal seams that were mined extensively for 200 plus years, which Professor Stiles says you basically frack at your own risk. But it's not your own risk because it's everybody else. And who's going to pay for the damages? Who pays for the damages caused by subsidence as a result of mining? Does it fall on the taxpayer ultimately, or insurance companies? Well, Quadrilla have now submitted their application to frack at Preston New Road. Quadrilla are financially supported by Centrica, which is the owner of British Gas, and by AJ Lucas, an Australian company that is also pretty much on its last legs and is desperate for Cuadrilla to have a successful frack job so that it lifts the value of AJ Lucas. But it's over areas that are heavily faulted, and as Cuadrilla proved back in 2011, they're not exactly up to date with the geological mapping because they fracked into a fault. Well, Cuadrilla have also been, of course, very much targeted by the local community and the anti-fracking community, and consequently they are coming to the end of their 17th month in a 6-month project. So Cuadrilla are a bit concerned about the magnitude of the opposition. So a few days ago, in fact on the same day that basically they announced that they were submitting their application to Greg Clark to frack, they produced this bundle and they deposited goodness knows how many, but it must run into many tens, if not 100 plus, of these bundles all around the Preston New Road well site and on all the multiple camps there. And this is an attempt to get an injunction to prevent any resistance beyond standing on the side of the road and waving a placard. And Cuadrilla here are trying to emulate INEOS and UCOG. INEOS, of course, don't have any existing well sites at the moment, but they wanted to get in ahead of the curve and establish their injunction to prevent any activity which effectively costs them in terms of delays or having to find new suppliers because suppliers pull out. And it looked like pretty much Justice Morgan had put that, to all intents and purposes, into effective legislation. This is the corporatocracy trying to establish a raft of legislation through the courts that is supra-parliamentary. But literally breaking news this evening, the case was challenged by Joe Boyd and Joe Corrie. And earlier today, the Royal Courts of Appeal have indeed granted permission for the two Joes to appeal the ruling put out by Justice Morgan. Now, this is absolutely seminal, and of course it will have a knock-on effect on the other applications by UCOG, and it's going to be very interesting to see what happens next Thursday when Cuadrilla bring this application against persons unknown at the Manchester courts on Thursday. So this is from the Cuadrilla website. It says, Cuadrilla, along with local farmers, has today filed papers to the High Court in preparation for a hearing on Thursday, 31st of May, for an injunction covering its shale gas exploration operations at Preston New Road, Lancashire. The proposed injunction would replace and extend the duration of an existing injunction forbidding trespass on the company's Preston New Road shale gas exploration site and surrounding farmland. It would also prohibit unlawful obstruction of the site entrance and adjacent main A road. This would include lock-ons, chaining oneself to an object or another person to deliberately prevent access, and climbing onto or slow walking in front of vehicles accessing or leaving the site. Unlawful disruption of Cuadrilla's supply chain by, for example, blockading supplier properties would also be covered by the proposed injunction. Francis Egan, Chief Executive of Cuadrilla, said, whilst we fully respect the right to peaceful and legal protest, unfortunately, over the last 18 months, we've seen an extraordinary high level of unlawful protest activity. This has been directed at and impacted not just our workers, but also our suppliers and other law-abiding citizens using the main road, passing our site for their normal daily activities. Such unlawful conduct cannot be permitted to continue, and we hope that if we can secure this injunction, it will deter this unlawful behaviour, which is reckless and continues to cost local taxpayers millions of pounds. The hearing is scheduled to take place at Manchester High Court District Registry Civil Justice Centre in Manchester at 10:30 this coming Thursday. Well, what Francis Egan is really saying is that once upon a time, we were tasked by the British government with getting social license. In other words, effectively quelling the opposition to the point where it was minimalistic and we could just crack on. Unfortunately, after 5.5 years since the moratorium was lifted, an increasing number of people have done their own research and are determined not to allow this industry to establish a foothold, for exactly the reasons that Professor Stiles outlines in this report, and looking at the way gold standard regulation has led to the contamination and the negative health impacts that have manifested pretty much everywhere where this industry has gained a footprint. So now they're asking the courts to effectively sanction their cowboy operations by threatening the people that have done their research, by threatening concerned citizens with civil actions, which is a threat against any assets they own, or maybe even their liberty. Well, what's interesting is that thanks to Mark Horn, who did some excellent work, but he's highlighted this statement here, and I'm just going to bring it, point out at the bottom here. This is Justice Morgan, and he makes the observation, he said, "I was not asked to refuse to grant injunctions on the ground that they would not be obeyed, and it would not be right to refuse relief on that ground. Equally, it is not appropriate for me to speculate as to the ease or difficulty which the claimants would have in seeking to enforce any clearly expressed injunctions." Well, first of all, obviously, every effort will be made to resisting these injunctions, to pointing out the illegality of these injunctions, of the fundamental threat to the rudiments of a democracy, even though most of us know it's a sham. But nonetheless, we will use whatever tools are available to resist this injunction. And if in the event an injunction is awarded, then it will be challenged. And it will be challenged in the most creative ways that we can come up with. And as for enforcing it, good luck with that. Because what you guys are doing by seeking these injunctions are actually flagging up the magnitude of your desperation. So thank you so much for helping us to raise awareness within the targeted communities and getting the targeted communities to understand that such is the desperation of this industry, that you are putting pressure on central government to remove all local authority participation, and then looking to effectively prevent any peaceful protest beyond standing in a free speech zone. Well, we managed to get that shut down last March, didn't we, Quadrilla? So I, for one, am actually looking forward to whatever next Thursday brings. I'm sure it will indeed be entertaining and enlightening. And the aftermath, regardless of the outcome, will also be much the same. And, you know, I got to say, full credit to the lock-on at Preston Road over the last few days. I believe it was 41 hours, which I believe is a new record, and sets a very high benchmark for future lock-ons to target. And I know there'll be lock-ons. There will be lock-ons. Absolutely given. Injunction or no injunction. So good luck with that, Quadrilla, because the British people are not going to roll over on this one. They're not going to let you contaminate the water. They're not going to let you poison the ecology and leave the legacy for future generations. So if you are at a loose end, on Thursday, this is where you need to come along to. The Civil Courts, 1 Bridge Street West, Manchester, M60 9DJ. Unfortunately, the parking right opposite the courts is outrageously expensive, so get there early and use some of the city centre multi-storey car parks, which are a lot cheaper. Well, I have no idea when I'm going to do another episode of Fracking Nightmare. I hope it's not another 5 months. And in fact, wouldn't it be great if my next episode of Fracking Nightmare was simply celebrating the fact that this industry has run its course, that basically they've finally acknowledged that the magnitude of the evidence and the increasing opposition is such they will never get a free ride. And they'll take a leaf out of Rathlin Energy's book. And Rathlin Energy recognised back in August of 2015 that they were never going to get a free ride into the well site at Crawberry Hill, and announced that they were going to relinquish it and return it to its former agricultural glory. That would be an amazing celebration and a great opportunity for Fracking Nightmare number 116. Meanwhile, I will continue with the morning broadcasts. So thanks to those of you who do follow and share, especially when I'm in Facebook jail. So I will catch with you tomorrow morning at 8:30 on my YouTube channel and on my Facebook page. So thanks again. Keep spreading the word, keep doing your own research, and keep the pressure on your elected representatives to let them know that under no circumstances will you ever concede this industry coming into your community. You have a great evening.